Imagine being so stubborn that you single-handedly invent an entire profession, so brilliant that you revolutionize military medicine while men in power actively work against you, and so devoted to your calling that you reject marriage proposals from eligible suitors because God literally told you that you had bigger things to do. Then imagine spending decades bedridden after your sacrifice, yet continuing to change the world from your sickbed, writing reports that would save millions of lives, training nurses who would spread your methods across continents, and becoming so legendary that soldiers worship you like a saint while you're still alive. That was Florence Nightingale's life. And if you think that sounds like the plot of an inspirational movie that took some creative liberties with reality, I promise you, every word is true, and it's actually more dramatic than any screenplay could capture. Florence wasn't just the lady with the lamp. She was a statistical genius who used data visualization to convince stubborn politicians to reform healthcare. She was a prolific writer who published over 200 books and pamphlets. She was a woman who defied every expectation of Victorian society, turned down marriage multiple times because she had a divine mission, and spent 30 years in bed, yet somehow accomplished more while confined to her room than most people do in a lifetime of perfect health. But here's what makes her story so compelling for those of us listening in the quiet hours when sleep won't come and we're searching for something meaningful. Florence Nightingale was difficult. She was demanding. She had a temper. She alienated people. She was so intense about her calling that she made everyone around her uncomfortable. She wasn't a perfect angel of mercy floating through hospital wards. She was a complicated, brilliant, exhausting woman who changed the world because she absolutely refused to accept things as they were. She fought her own family for decades. She battled military bureaucracy that literally preferred soldiers to die rather than listen to a woman's suggestions. She endured constant pain and illness. She watched thousands of young men die from preventable causes and carried that trauma for the rest of her life. And through all of it, she kept working, kept fighting, kept demanding that the world be better. If you're watching with tired eyes and an overthinking mind, this story is for you. If you really enjoy these bedtime journeys through history that celebrate women who refuse to be quiet, who change the world despite everything working against them, please like this video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I always love knowing where these stories are keeping you company late at night. Tonight, we're meeting Florence Nightingale, mystic, statistician, hospital reformer, the founder of modern nursing, and a woman whose stubbornness literally saved millions of lives. Spoiler alert, she doesn't get the happy ending Victorian novels promised women who sacrificed everything. But what she gets instead is so much more interesting. Florence Nightingale was born on May 12, 1820 in Florence, Italy, hence the name, which had never been used as a girl's name before her parents decided to get creative with their travel souvenirs. Her older sister was named Parthenope after the Greek name for Naples, which tells you everything about their parents' approach to child names. Let's just name them after wherever we happen to be when they were born and hope it works out. Surprisingly, Florence did beautifully. Parthenope, nicknamed Partha, is perhaps why her sister developed a lifelong resentment that would play a significant role in Florence's story. Imagine going through life introducing yourself as Parthenope while your younger sister gets to be Florence. The psychological damage starts early. Their parents, William Edward Shaw and Frances Fanny Smith, were wealthy British landowners who'd married young and spent their early years travelling through Europe because that's what rich people did when they had more money than sense and no actual jobs. William had inherited 2 estates, Leahurst in Derbyshire and Embley Park in Hampshire, along with an annual income of about $7,000, which in 1820s money meant they were seriously wealthy. The kind of wealthy where you never work a day in your life and still have servants to manage your other servant. The family returned to England when Florence was about a year old, settling into a life of aristocratic comfort that would have been perfectly pleasant if Florence had been content to be a normal, wealthy Victorian girl. But Florence Nightingale was constitutionally incapable of being normal about anything. The Victorian era had very specific expectations for women of the upper class, and they can be summarized as look pretty, marry well, produce heirs, run a household, engage in genteel hobbies like watercolor painting or playing the piano, and for God's sake, don't think too much or have opinions about important matters. Women were supposed to be decorative and domestic. Their sphere was the home. Their purpose was supporting their husband and raising children. Anything beyond that was considered unfeminine, inappropriate, and vaguely threatening to the social order. Florence looked at these expectations and thought, absolutely not. Her father, William, was unusual for his time. He actually believed women should be educated. While most Victorian fathers considered educating daughters beyond basic accomplishments a waste of resources, William took personal responsibility for his daughters' education. He taught them Italian, Latin, Greek, philosophy, history, writing, and mathematics. Real mathematics, not the ladies' arithmetic that barely qualified as counting. This was revolutionary. Most women of Florence's class learned enough to manage household accounts and carry on polite conversation. Florence learned to read classical texts in their original languages, to think critically about philosophy and history, to understand complex mathematical concepts. Her father essentially gave her a classical education equivalent to what wealthy boys received at private school, except Florence got personalized tutoring from someone who genuinely enjoyed intellectual discourse. It was possibly the best thing and the worst thing William ever did for his daughter. Best, because it gave Florence the intellectual tools she'd need to revolutionize healthcare. Worst, because it made her completely unsuited for the life Victorian society expected her. Imagine being taught to think critically, to analyze problems, to engage with complex ideas, and then being told that your entire future consists of managing servants, attending tea parties, and making polite conversation about the weather. It's like training someone to be an engineer and then asking them to spend their life arranging flowers. The mismatch is maddening. Florence's intelligence was obvious from childhood. She was curious, intense, obsessive about learning. She would have been called gifted or brilliant if she'd been a boy. But she was a girl, and brilliant girls in Victorian England were a problem without a solution. There was literally no acceptable outlet for a woman's intellectual ambition beyond perhaps writing novels under a male pseudonym. Her mother Fanny and sister Partha couldn't understand Florence's dissatisfaction with their lifestyle. They loved the social whirl of country estates, London seasons, parties, visiting, entertaining. This was what life was supposed to be: comfortable, pleasant, socially engaged. Why couldn't Florence just be happy? But Florence was desperately, suffocatingly unhappy. She called the life of a wealthy Victorian lady the prison of family life. She felt her intelligence and energy were being wasted on trivialities while she was capable of so much more. She experienced what we might now recognize as depression, describing a fog that surrounded her, a sense that she was living in an unreal world where nothing meaningful could happen. Her private diaries from this period are heartbreaking. She wrote about feeling trapped, about time passing uselessly, about her family's demands consuming every moment, so that she had no time for the work she felt called to do, except she didn't know yet what that work was. She just knew that arranging flowers and paying social calls wasn't it. The marriage proposals started when she was 16. Florence was attractive, wealthy, well-educated, and from a good family, exactly the kind of girl who should have married well and settled into comfortable domesticity. Multiple eligible men proposed. Every single time, Florence said, no. This was scandalous. Women were supposed to want marriage. Marriage was the ultimate goal, the only respectable future for a woman of her class. Unmarried women were pitied or mocked as spinsters. The idea that a woman might deliberately choose to remain single was almost incomprehensible. But Florence knew that marriage would be the end of any possibility of meaningful work. A married woman belonged to her husband. Her time, her energy, her very identity was subsumed into his. She would be expected to manage his household, host his social obligations, bear his children, and support his ambitions. Her own ambitions, if she had any, were irrelevant. Florence wanted something more. She didn't know exactly what yet, but she knew it wasn't marriage. On February 7, 1837, 17-year-old Florence Nightingale received what she would later describe as a direct call from God. She was absolutely certain that God spoke to her, telling her that she had a divine mission, a specific purpose that she was meant to fulfill. This wasn't a vague spiritual feeling. Florence believed she received actual instructions from God throughout her life. She heard a voice. She felt a presence. She was convinced that she'd been chosen for something important, something that would require her complete devotion. For context, this was not normal, even by Victorian religious standards. The Victorians were very religious, certainly, but direct divine communication was generally considered something that happened in the Bible, not to middle-class girls in Hampshire. If you told people that God spoke to you directly with specific instructions, they'd probably suggest you needed rest, fresh air, and possibly medical intervention. Florence wisely kept this mostly to herself, but it changed everything. She now had certainty that her dissatisfaction with conventional life wasn't just rebellious selfishness, it was divine guidance. God had a plan for her, and that plan did not involve marrying well and hosting dinner parties. The problem was figuring out what exactly God wanted her to do. The calling was clear, the specifics were not. Florence spent years searching for her, trying to understand what form her service should take. She started visiting the poor and sick near her family's estates, bringing food and medicine. This was acceptable charitable work for a wealthy lady. Lady Bountiful, visiting the deserving poor, was a recognized role. But Florence wasn't satisfied with dropping off baskets and leaving. She wanted to actually help, to understand what was wrong, to make a real difference. She became increasingly interested in hospitals and nursing. She would question doctors about diseases, treatments, patient care. She read everything she could find about medical care and public health, which wasn't much because most medical knowledge was hoarded by doctors and not shared with the general public. Then she asked a family friend, who was a doctor, a question that would change her life. Would it be inappropriate for her to work in a hospital? His response was honest. Yes, absolutely. Hospitals in the 1840s were places of horror. They were filthy, chaotic, dangerous. Most patients died. Nurses were generally alcoholic, uneducated women from the lowest social classes who took the job because no other work was available. The nursing profession had a reputation barely above prostitution. For a wealthy, educated young woman to want to work in a hospital was shocking, potentially scandalous, definitely inappropriate. But then he said, if you feel called to do it, you should follow that calling regardless of what society thinks. Florence heard him, and she made a decision that would put her in conflict with her family for decades. Florence told her family that she wanted to train as a nurse. Their reaction was predictable. Absolutely not. Over their dead bodies. Never. Fanny and Parth were horrified. This wasn't just unconventional. It was social suicide. A Nightingale, working alongside uneducated, immoral women in filthy hospitals, exposing herself to disease, death, and impropriety. It was unthinkable. What would people say? How could they show their faces in society? William was more sympathetic to Florence's intellectual ambitions, but even he couldn't support this. Nursing wasn't a profession for a lady. It was degrading work. He'd educated her to think and read and engage with ideas, not to empty bedpans and scrub floors. Florence tried to pursue her calling anyway. She secretly obtained reports about hospitals and nursing training programs in Europe. She studied every document she could find. She dreamed of going to Kaiserswerth in Germany, where Pastor Theodor Fliedner had established a hospital with a training program for deaconesses, Protestant women who dedicated their lives to nursing the sick. Her family blocked every attempt. They needed her at home. Parthe needed Florence's companionship. Fanny needed Florence to help manage the household and fulfill social obligations. They kept her so busy with family demands that she had no time to pursue her own interests. This went on for years. Florence was essentially held hostage by family duty, that Victorian concept that demanded women sacrifice their own desires to serve their family's needs. Every time she tried to break free, they pulled her back with guilt, tears, and accusations of selfishness. Florence's diaries from this period reveal someone on the edge of a breakdown. She wrote about feeling suffocated, about days and months and years passing uselessly, about her family consuming her life while she accomplished nothing meaningful. She experienced periods of deep depression and what she called dreaming, dissociating from reality because reality was too painful. She was also dealing with suitors. In 1842, Richard Monckton Milnes began pursuing her. He was actually a good match, educated, literary, interested in social reform, the kind of man who might understand her intellectual ambitions. He proposed. She refused. He asked again over several years. She kept refusing. Why? Because even a good husband would still be a husband, and marriage would mean the end of her calling. A married woman couldn't go live in a hospital to train as a nurse. She couldn't dedicate herself entirely to work that would take her away from home for months or years. Marriage was a golden cage, and Florence had already refused one cage, her family's, so she certainly wasn't going to walk into another. In 1847, Florence became obsessed with the idea of going to Salisbury Hospital to train. Her family refused permission. Florence was 27 years old, well past the age of majority. But Victorian daughters didn't defy their parents. The social pressure to conform, to obey, to sacrifice personal desires for family harmony was crushing. Parthe's reaction to Florence's ambitions was particularly intense. She had what we'd now call a nervous breakdown whenever Florence tried to leave. She would become hysterical, physically ill, emotionally distraught. Doctors would be. The family would rally around poor Parthe while Florence was blamed for causing her sister's illness through her selfish desires. This was emotional manipulation, whether conscious or not. Parthe and Fanny were using illness and hysteria to control Florence, and it was remarkably effective. Victorian women were expected to be self-sacrificing, to put others' needs first. A daughter who pursued her own goals while her sister suffered was cruel, unfeminine, unnatural. Florence was trapped. She was brilliant, ambitious, divinely called, and absolutely stuck. She couldn't pursue her purpose without destroying her family relationship, but she couldn't abandon her calling without destroying herself. The internal conflict was destroying her health. She had what were probably psychosomatic symptoms: weakness, depression, physical collapse. Her family used this as evidence that she needed to stay home and rest, not understanding that home was exactly what was making her sick. This period of her life, roughly from ages 17 to 30, was characterized by what she later called the long probation. God had called her. She knew her purpose, but she couldn't act on it. She was forced to wait, to endure, to live in prison, while her calling remained unfulfilled. In 1849, Florence's family finally agreed to let her travel to Egypt with friends. It was supposed to be a pleasure trip, a chance to see ancient wonders, the kind of grand tour wealthy people took for cultural enrichment. Florence used it as an escape. Away from her family's immediate control, she could breathe. She could think. She visited hospitals in Alexandria and Cairo, observing how they operated. She had a profound spiritual experience at Karnak, feeling God's presence and reaffirming her calling. During this trip, she solidified her determination. She would become a nurse, regardless of her family's objections. She was nearly 30 years old, and she'd wasted enough time. When she returned to England, she was more resolute. She continued to collect information about hospitals and nursing training programs. And finally, in 1850, her family permitted her to visit Kaiserswerth for 2 weeks. Kaiserswerth was Florence's first real glimpse of what her life could be. It was a Protestant institution where deaconesses lived communally and trained to nurse the sick. The nursing wasn't sophisticated by modern standards. The deaconesses had minimal medical training, but they were dedicated, organized, and treated nursing as a calling rather than just a job. Florence was fascinated. This was what she wanted: a life dedicated to service, to caring for the sick, to meaningful work. The fact that Kaiserswerth was also uncomfortable, the food was terrible, and the nursing training was basic didn't matter. It represented freedom. Her family was horrified when she published a pamphlet about Kaiserswerth. She'd written it anonymously, but people who knew her could guess the author. Florence Nightingale had essentially announced to society that she was interested in nursing, which was like announcing that she planned to take up a career in cleaning sewers. It was shocking, inappropriate, and confirmed everyone's suspicions that Florence was dangerously eccentric. In 1851, Richard Monckton Milnes proposed for the final time. Florence refused definitively. She wrote him a letter explaining that she couldn't marry anyone because she had a calling that would consume her entire life. It was perhaps the most honest rejection in Victorian courtship history. I can't marry you because God has plans for me that don't include a husband. Milnes married someone else 2 years later. Florence never married. She chose her calling over romance, social approval, family harmony, and everything else Victorian society said women should. In 1851, she also finally got her family's permission to return to Kaiserswerth for 3 months of actual training. Her family was still unhappy about it, but Florence had worn them down through sheer stubborn persistence. She was 31 years old, finally beginning the work she'd been called to do 2 decades earlier. The training at Kaiserswerth was basic. It focused more on religious devotion and moral character than medical skills, but Florence absorbed everything. She learned about patient care, about managing sick wards, about the daily routines of nursing. More importantly, she learned that she was capable of this work, that she'd been right about her calling. When she returned to England, she was changed. She was confident, determined, ready to fight for her future. She'd proven to herself that she could do this work. Now she just needed the opportunity to do it properly. In 1853, Florence's father finally gave her an allowance of $500 per year, enough to live independently. This was crucial. Victorian women rarely had their own money. They went from father's support to husband's support, never having financial independence. William's allowance gave Florence freedom she'd never had before. She immediately began looking for positions. She wasn't interested in conventional nursing in workhouse hospitals. She wanted reform, innovation, proper organization. She found it in an unlikely place: the Institution for the Care of Sick Gentlewomen in Distressed Circumstances. This was basically a charity hospital for middle-class women who'd fallen on hard times: governesses, companion ladies, the respectable poor who didn't belong in workhouse hospitals but couldn't afford private care. The institution was small, somewhat disorganized, and needed a superintendent. Florence applied. The committee was hesitant about appointing an unmarried woman with no official nursing experience to run their institution. But Florence's references were impeccable. Her intelligence was obvious, and her passion for reform was compelling. They offered her the position. Florence's family was still unhappy, but she'd stopped asking for permission. She moved into the institution's building at 1 Harley Street in August 1853 and immediately began revolutionizing their operations. She installed a system where patients could ring bells to summon nurses rather than waiting for periodic check-ins. This sounds simple, but it was revolutionary. It gave patients agency and ensured they could get help when needed, rather than when it was convenient for staff. She fought with the committee about admitting Catholic and Jewish patients. The committee wanted to limit admission to Anglican women. Florence insisted that sick women deserved care regardless of their religion. She won. She reorganized the entire institution's operation, improving the food, ensuring proper sanitation, training the nurses in better patient care. She was demanding, exacting, and absolutely brilliant at management. She was also working herself to exhaustion. Florence didn't know how to work at a normal pace. She was making up for decades of enforced idleness, and she threw herself into her work with an intensity that alarmed everyone around her. But she was happy. For the first time in her life, Florence was doing what she believed God had called her to do. She was making a tangible difference. She was using her intelligence and education for something meaningful. She was free. Her reputation began to grow. People in London's reform circles knew about this brilliant woman at Harley Street who was bringing modern management techniques to hospital care. Sidney Herbert, a politician and reformer who would become crucial to Florence's story, was aware of her work. Elizabeth Blackwell, the first woman doctor in America, met Florence during a visit to London and recognized a kindred spirit. Florence was becoming known as an expert in hospital management and nursing reform. She was 33 years old, unmarried, living independently, and building a career in a field that didn't technically exist yet as a profession. Everything was coming together. Florence had crossed the threshold from her old life to her new one. She'd escaped her family's control, found meaningful work, and begun to make her mark. And then the Crimean War began, and everything changed again. In October 1853, the Crimean War began. It started over a dispute about which Christian sects should control holy sites in Jerusalem, a minor religious argument that escalated into a major war involving the Ottoman Empire, Russia, France, and Britain. The causes were complicated and stupid, involving centuries of religious tensions, power politics, and the slow collapse of the Ottoman Empire. What matters for our story is that Britain sent troops to fight alongside France and the Ottomans against Russia in the Crimean Peninsula. And those British troops started dying in alarming numbers, not from combat, but from disease and neglect. William Howard Russell, a correspondent for the Times newspaper, sent back devastating reports from the front. British soldiers were dying of cholera, dysentery, and typhus because military hospitals lacked basic supplies. They had no beds, no bandages, no medical care beyond the most rudimentary surgery. The hospitals were filthy, overcrowded, and essentially death traps. Meanwhile, French hospitals were reportedly much better organized. They had supplies. They had nursing sisters from Catholic religious orders caring for the sick. Their soldiers had a better chance of survival. The British public was outraged. The newspapers were filled with letters demanding reform. How could Britain send men to fight and die, then abandon them to suffer in filthy hospitals? Why were French soldiers receiving better care than British ones? Sidney Herbert, Secretary at War, was personally responsible for military hospitals. He needed to do something dramatic to address the public outcry. He needed someone capable of organizing nursing care at the military hospitals in Scutari, near Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, where the sick and wounded were being sent. He thought of Florence Nightingale. On October 15, 1854, Herbert wrote to Florence asking if she would go to Scutari to organize nursing care for British soldiers. It was an unprecedented request. No woman had ever been officially appointed to a British military hospital. The position didn't technically exist. Coincidentally, Florence had written to Herbert the same day, volunteering to go to Scutari. Their letters crossed in the mail. Both had recognized that this was a unique opportunity, a crisis severe enough that the military would be forced to accept female nurses, something that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. Florence accepted immediately. This was what she'd been training for, though she didn't know it. Everything, her education, her hospital management experience, her religious calling, her decades of frustrated ambition had prepared her for this moment. She was given official authority as superintendent of the female nursing establishment of the English General Hospitals in Turkey. It was a mouthful of a title, but it gave her actual power, something women rarely had in Victorian society. She recruited 38 nurses to accompany her, 14 Anglican nurses from various institutions, 10 Catholic sisters, 8 Anglican sisters from Selenites, and 6 nurses from St. John's House. This careful religious balance was necessary. Any appearance of favouring one denomination over another would cause scandal. The nurses weren't all qualified. Some were excellent. Others were basically alcoholics who'd take any job. Florence knew she'd have to train them on the job, while simultaneously organising an entire hospital system from scratch. But she had no time to be choosy. On October 21st, 1854, just 6 days after receiving Herbert's letter, Florence and her nurses departed for Scutari. She was 34 years old, officially representing the British government in a capacity no woman had held before, heading into a war zone. Her family was horrified but couldn't stop her. Florence had official government authorization. She was finally doing exactly what she believed God had called her to do, 27 years after first receiving that call. The journey to Scutari took 2 weeks. They travelled by boat across the Mediterranean through terrible weather. Florence used the time to organise her nurses, establish rules and expectations, and prepare for whatever they'd find. What they found was worse than anyone had imagined. The Barrack Hospital at Scutari was a massive structure that had once housed Turkish soldiers. When the British took it over for their wounded, they didn't bother with minor details, like cleaning or equipping it properly. It sat on the Bosphorus, looking impressive from the outside, a complete disaster from the inside. Florence and her nurses arrived on November 5th, 1854, and entered hell. The building was infested with rats and fleas. The water supply was contaminated. The pipes ran through a dead horse carcass that had been rotting in the water system for weeks. There were no beds. Patients lay on the floor in their uniforms, which were stiff with blood and filth. There were no blankets, no towels, no soap, no bandages, no medical supplies beyond what individual doctors had managed to requisition. The building sat on top of a massive cesspool, a lake of sewage that seeped into the foundation and filled the air with poisonous gases. The ventilation was non-existent. The place reeked of death, disease, and human waste. Wounded soldiers were crammed into the corridors. Some had been lying in their own filth for days, waiting for treatment that never came. Their wounds were infected, turning gangrenous. They were dying of cholera, dysentery, typhus, and typhoid. Many were frostbitten from the journey to the hospital. They were starving because the food was inedible: hard bread, rancid meat, contaminated water. The medical staff was overwhelmed and undersupplied. The doctors had almost no medicines, no proper surgical instruments, no way to help their patients beyond the most basic interventions. Many doctors resented Florence's presence. A woman telling them how to run their hospital was an insult to their professional dignity. Florence assessed the situation with the cold clarity of someone who'd spent years studying hospital management. The problem wasn't just supplies, though supplies were desperately needed. The problem was systemic chaos. There was no organization, no management, no accountability. Nobody was in charge. Nobody was responsible. Things weren't getting done because there was no system for getting things done. She set to work immediately. First, the nurses. Florence established strict rules. The nurses would not enter the wards unless specifically requested by doctors. This was strategic. If she pushed too hard too fast, the doctors would reject her entirely. She needed to prove that her nurses were useful, that they would support medical staff rather than interfere with them. Her nurses would work in shifts, maintain appropriate behaviour at all times, and follow Florence's orders without question. Any nurse who drank, showed improper behaviour, or disobeyed would be sent home immediately. Florence ran her nursing corps like a military unit, which made sense since they were in a military hospital. Second, supplies. Florence had brought $30,000 of supplies purchased with funds from the Times newspaper's public. She also had her personal money and wasn't afraid to spend it. She immediately purchased supplies the military hadn't provided. 200 scrubbing brushes, clean shirts for 2,000 men, socks, plates, cups, knives and forks, wooden spoons, towels, soap, medical supplies, food. She hired local workers to scrub the entire hospital from top to bottom. They cleaned floors, walls, ceilings. They boiled clothes and linens to kill the lice and fleas. They opened windows to ventilate the wards, despite military resistance to the idea that fresh air might help sick people. Third, food. Florence set up kitchens that could produce actually edible meals. She made sure patients received proper nutrition: broth, clean bread, tea, vegetables. She established a system where severely ill patients received special diets, rather than the same hard rations as everyone else. Fourth, basic dignity. She made sure wounded soldiers had clean clothes, clean bedding, a place to wash. She wrote letters for men too weak to write themselves, informing their families where they were. She made sure men died with someone holding their hand rather than alone in a corridor. The work was exhausting and endless. Florence was up at dawn, worked until midnight, walked miles through the hospital wards every day checking on patients, supplies, cleanliness. She supervised her nurses, argued with military officials, requisitioned supplies, managed finances, wrote reports to Herbert in London, and at night she took her lamp and walked through the wards one final time, checking on patients, offering comfort, making sure no one needed anything before she rested for a few hours. The soldiers adored her. They'd been abandoned by their government, left to die in filth, and suddenly here was this woman who actually cared whether they lived or died. She fought for them. She demanded they receive proper treatment. She stayed with dying men, wrote to their mothers, made sure they were buried with dignity. They called her the Lady with the Lamp, after a poem by Longfellow that described her lamp's light, bringing comfort through the darkness of the hospital wards. Her shadow passing through the corridors was a sign that someone was watching over them, that they hadn't been forgotten. But Florence knew the lamp imagery was sentimental nonsense. Yes, she checked on patients at night, but the real work was the brutal, unglamorous task of establishing sanitation, organizing supply chains, training nurses, reforming hospital management, and fighting bureaucracy. The doctors gradually came to respect her, or at least stopped actively opposing her. Some became genuine allies. Dr. John Hall, the Army's chief medical officer, remained hostile throughout, viewing Florence as an interfering woman who'd been sent to expose his incompetence. He wasn't entirely wrong about the second part. The mortality rate began to drop, though not as dramatically as Florence hoped. Men were still dying in alarming numbers. Florence knew that cleaning and organization weren't enough. Something fundamental was wrong with the hospital, but she didn't yet understand what. What she didn't know, what nobody knew until later, was that the hospital itself was poisoning the patients. The building sat on that massive cesspool, and the contamination was seeping into everything. The lack of proper sewage disposal, the contaminated water supply, the poor ventilation. These were creating conditions where disease thrived. Florence was fighting death itself, and she wasn't winning yet, but she refused to give. By January 1855, Florence had transformed the Barrack Hospital's operations. It was clean, it was organized, patients received proper care, the nurses were trained and disciplined, supply chains were established, the whole system functioned efficiently, but men were still dying. The mortality rate remained horrific. 42% of patients admitted to the hospital died there. Florence had improved conditions dramatically, but she hadn't solved the fundamental problem. Then came February 1855, when the mortality rate suddenly began to drop. It fell from 42% to 22% to eventually just 2%. an astonishing improvement that saved thousands of lives. Why? Because a sanitary commission finally arrived from England and addressed the sewage problem. They flushed the cesspool, fixed the water supply, improved ventilation, and eliminated the environmental factors that had been killing patients despite Florence's best effort. Florence immediately understood the significance. The dramatic drop in mortality coincided exactly with the sanitation improvement. This meant that clean water, proper sewage disposal, and good ventilation were more important than any medical treatment. This meant that most soldiers had been dying not from their wounds, but from disease caused by filthy conditions. This revelation would become central to Florence's life work. Clean air, clean water, proper sanitation. These prevented disease more effectively than any medicine. If you wanted to save lives, you didn't need expensive treatments. You needed basic hygiene and proper hospital design. But understanding this came too late to save many of the men who'd already died. Florence carried the weight of those deaths for the rest of her life. She'd worked herself to exhaustion trying to save them, and thousands had died anyway because she hadn't understood the environmental factors quickly. She contracted Crimean fever in May 1855, probably typhoid or brucellosis. The records aren't clear. She nearly died. For days, she burned with fever, delirious and weak. Her nurses cared for her. The army sent bulletins about her condition back to England, where the public was devastated at the thought of losing their lady with the lamp. She survived, but was never truly healthy again. The fever damaged her heart and left her with chronic pain and weakness that would plague her for the next 50 years. Some historians believe she developed chronic brucellosis, which causes recurring fatigue, pain, and weakness. Others think she suffered from what we'd now call post-traumatic stress disorder, along with the physical effects of exhaustion and disease. Whatever the medical explanation, the Crimea broke Florence's health. She'd given everything, her energy, her strength, her health, to save soldiers. And now, she would spend decades as an invalid, confined largely to her bedroom, in constant pain. But she refused to stop working. She remained in Scutari until July 1856, 4 months after the war officially ended. She wanted to see every last patient properly cared for before she left. She visited other hospitals in the region, spreading her reforms. She documented everything: mortality rates, supply costs, management systems, because she knew this data would be crucial for future reform. When she finally returned to England, she did so secretly. She travelled under the name Miss Smith to avoid public attention, arriving at her family's estate without fanfare. The public wanted to celebrate her as a national hero. Florence wanted to be left alone to continue her work. She'd won. She'd proven that women could serve in military hospitals, that proper nursing could save lives, that organisation and sanitation mattered more than heroic medicine. She'd become the most famous woman in Britain besides Queen Victoria, and she'd paid for it with her health, her peace of mind, and the traumatic memory of thousands of young men dying despite her best effort. Florence Nightingale returned to England as a national hero in 1856. The public adored her. Songs were written about her. Products were marketed with her image. Parents named their daughters Florence in her honour. She was invited to balls, celebrations, public ceremonies. She refused them all. She wasn't interested in being a celebrity. She was interested in reform. The problem, as Florence saw it, was that she'd saved lives in Scutari through individual effort and extraordinary circumstances. But once she left, what would prevent the same disasters from happening in the next war? The military medical system was still fundamentally broken. Unless she could reform that system, her work in the Crimea would be a temporary victory, followed by future catastrophe. So Florence set out to revolutionize military medicine, sanitation, and hospital design, and she planned to do it from her bedroom because her health had collapsed entirely. In August 1857, Florence moved into the Burlington Hotel in London and essentially never left her room again for any sustained period. She claimed she was too weak to walk, too ill to travel, too exhausted to attend meetings in person. Whether this was entirely physical illness or partly psychological, a way to control her environment and avoid the social obligations that would interfere with her work, historians debate. What's certain is that Florence accomplished more while bedridden than most people accomplish with perfect health and unlimited mobility. She turned her bedroom into a command centre for healthcare reform. She began working with Sidney Herbert to establish a royal commission to investigate the health of the British Army. This was her big goal, an official government investigation that would expose the military medical system's failures and force reforms. The establishment resisted. The military didn't want civilians, especially females, investigating operations. But Florence had something they didn't: data. She'd kept meticulous records in Scutari. She knew exactly how many men had died, from what causes, at what time. She could prove that more British soldiers died from disease than from combat, that the military's own negligence killed more men than Russian soldiers. But raw numbers weren't enough to convince politicians. So Florence, with her mathematical education, created something revolutionary: visual data representation. She invented what's now called a polar area diagram, or Nightingale-Rose diagram, a circular graph that showed mortality causes over time in a format that was immediately, viscerally understandable. Her diagrams proved that soldiers in barracks during peacetime died at twice the rate of civilians from similar backgrounds. They proved that most Crimean war deaths were preventable. They proved that sanitation reform could save thousands of lives. This was revolutionary. Statistical analysis existed, but presenting data visually to influence policy was new. Florence essentially invented data visualization for policy advocacy. She understood that politicians wouldn't read dense reports full of numbers, but they'd be moved by graphics that showed dramatic disparities between preventable deaths and combat death. The Royal Commission was established in May 1857, with Sidney Herbert as chairman. Florence wasn't officially part of it. Women couldn't serve on government commissions, but she was the real force behind it. Herbert visited her daily at the Burlington Hotel. She wrote reports, drafted questions, analyzed data, and basically ran the entire investigation from her bedroom. She also wrote constantly to anyone who might help: politicians, military officials, doctors, reformers. Her correspondence was staggering. She wrote thousands of letters, many running to dozens of pages, all arguing for specific reforms with detailed evidence. She was demanding, difficult, and absolutely relentless. If you agreed to help Florence Nightingale with reforms, you just volunteered for years of detailed instructions, constant correspondence, and no rest until the work was done. She exhausted everyone around her. The Royal Commission published its report in 1858, recommending massive reforms: better sanitation in barracks and hospitals, improved medical training, better diet for soldiers, proper ventilation in buildings, clean water supply, statistical record keeping to track health outcomes. Florence had won. Her reforms would be implemented, and British soldiers would be significantly safer as a result. But she wasn't satisfied with just military reform. She wanted to transform civilian healthcare too. In 1859, Florence published Notes on Nursing: What It Is and What It Is Not, a short book that became phenomenally successful. It sold 15,000 copies within a month and was translated into multiple languages. This wasn't a medical textbook. It was a practical guide for anyone caring for the sick, whether in hospitals or at home. The book's genius was its accessibility. Florence wrote clearly and directly about basic hygiene, proper ventilation, diet, cleanliness, and observation of patients. She explained that nursing wasn't just following doctors' orders. It was creating an environment where healing could happen. Some of her advice sounds obvious now. Keep the sick room clean and well ventilated. Wash your hands. Observe patients carefully for changes in condition. Make sure they have adequate nutrition. But in 1859, these weren't standard practices. Many people thought fresh air was dangerous for sick people. Hand washing wasn't routine. Patient observation was haphazard. Florence laid out the principles that would become the foundation of modern nursing: cleanliness, observation, documentation, and creating therapeutic environments. She insisted that nursing was skilled work requiring training, intelligence, and dedication, not just uneducated women doing whatever doctors told them. The book made Florence even more famous, but more importantly, it established her as the authority on nursing care. When people thought about nursing reform, they thought about Florence Nightingale. This gave her the credibility she needed to launch her biggest project, the Nightingale Training School for Nurses. After Florence returned from the Crimea, a grateful public had raised a fund in her honour, the Nightingale Fund, which eventually totaled 45,000 sols. For years, Florence didn't know what to do with it. The money sat in a bank while she figured out how to use it most effectively. By 1860, she'd decided she would establish the first professional nursing school, not a religious order where women nursed as part of devotional service, but a secular institution that trained nurses as skilled professionals. The Nightingale Training School for Nurses opened at St. Thomas's Hospital in London on July 9, 1860. Florence wasn't there. She was in her bedroom at the Burlington Hotel, too ill to attend. But she'd designed every aspect of the program. The school accepted 15 students for its first year, young women who wanted to become professional nurses. They received 1 year of training that combined practical hospital work with theoretical instruction. They learned anatomy, physiology, the principles of nursing care, hospital management, and the importance of hygiene and sanitation. More importantly, they learned that nursing was a respectable profession worthy of intelligent, educated women. Florence's students came from better social backgrounds than typical hospital nurses. She wanted to elevate nursing's status by attracting women who had other options but chose nursing as a calling. The students lived together in a nurses' home, following strict moral codes. Florence believed that nursing required good character as much as good skills. Her nurses had to be sober, moral, disciplined, and dedicated. The profession's reputation depended on it. After completing their training, Nightingale nurses went out to hospitals across Britain and around the world, spreading Florence's methods. They became matrons and superintendents, establishing nursing schools in other hospitals, training new generations of nurses in Nightingale principles. This was Florence's real genius. She didn't just reform nursing, she created a system that perpetuated itself. Her trained nurses trained others, who trained others, spreading her methods exponentially. Within decades, professional nursing based on Florence's model existed worldwide. The school wasn't without problems. Some graduates weren't suitable for nursing. Some hospitals resisted the Nightingale methods. Some male doctors resented trained nurses who might question their decisions. But overall, the experiment was wildly successful. Florence continued to direct the school from her bedroom, corresponding with the matron, reviewing student reports, advising on curriculum changes. She was intimately involved in every detail, despite never visiting the school in person. She was also working on hospital design reform. She became obsessed with the idea that hospital architecture itself could promote healing or cause disease. Her book, Notes on Hospitals, laid out principles for building hospitals that wouldn't kill patients through bad ventilation and poor sanitation. She advocated for the pavilion plan, hospitals designed as separate wings or pavilions, each with large windows for cross-ventilation, high ceilings, and plenty of space between beds. This design prevented disease from spreading through entire buildings and ensured fresh air reached every patient. Her designs influenced hospital construction across Britain and beyond. Hospitals built on Nightingale principles had dramatically lower mortality rates than older hospitals. Once again, Florence had proven that environment mattered, that you could save lives through good design as much as through medical treatment. She worked on workhouse infirmary reform, trying to improve conditions for the poor who fell ill. She advised the Indian government on sanitation and public health. She wrote reports on everything from midwifery training to soldiers' reading room, and she did all of this from her bedroom, maintaining that she was too weak to leave, that her health was broken, that she was on the verge of death. Yet somehow, this dying invalid produced an astonishing amount of work, writing, correspondence, advising, reforming, never stopping. Sidney Herbert died in 1861, and Florence was devastated. He'd been her closest ally, her connection to political power, her friend. She blamed herself for his death, believing she'd worked him too hard with her constant demands for reform. The guilt consumed her. She became even more reclusive. She saw fewer visitors. She claimed her health was worse than ever, but she kept working. In 1862, she began advising on nursing care during the American Civil War. She corresponded with Dorothea Dix, the Union Army's superintendent of nurses, sharing her Crimean experience and offering suggestions for organizing military nursing. The American nurses faced similar challenges Florence had encountered: resistance from doctors, inadequate supplies, chaotic conditions, and Florence's advice helped them navigate those obstacles. She continued to write prolifically. Between 1858 and 1861, she produced over 200 written works: books, reports, pamphlets, letters to newspapers, private notes to politicians. She was essentially running a one-woman policy think tank from her bedroom. Her influence was extraordinary. Government officials sought her advice on everything related to health and sanitation. When India experienced famine and disease outbreaks, British administrators asked Florence for recommendations. When new hospitals were planned, architects consulted her designs. When nursing schools were established, they followed her model. She received visitors, but on her term. You came to her bedroom at appointed times. You discussed whatever she wanted to discuss. You left when she was tired. This level of control was unusual for a woman, but Florence had earned it through her accomplishments. Queen Victoria herself sought Florence's advice and corresponded with her regularly. The Queen wanted to understand military medical reform and trusted Florence's expertise more than any official report. This was unprecedented, a reigning monarch regularly consulting with an unmarried woman about government policy. In 1883, Florence was awarded the Royal Red Cross by Queen Victoria, the first woman to receive it. In 1904, she became the first woman to receive the Order of Merit, Britain's highest civilian honour, personally awarded by King Edward VII. But Florence didn't care much about honours. She cared about results. She watched as her trained nurses spread across the world. Nightingale nurses worked in hospitals throughout Britain, in Australia and New Zealand, in Canada, in India. They became matrons and superintendents, reforming hospitals wherever they went. They trained new nurses, who trained more nurses, creating an exponential spread of professional nursing. By the 1880s and 1890s, professional nursing based on Florence's model was standard across much of the developed world. Hospitals were cleaner, better organized, and far safer than they'd been 50 years earlier. Nursing was a respected profession that attracted educated, capable women who saw it as meaningful work rather than desperate employment. Florence had accomplished what she'd set out to do. She'd transformed nursing from disreputable drudgery into a skilled profession. She'd revolutionized hospital design and sanitation. She'd proven that statistical analysis could drive healthcare policy. She'd saved countless lives through her reforms. And she'd done it while claiming to be an invalid who could barely leave her bed. As Florence aged, something unexpected happened. Her health actually improved. The woman who'd claimed for decades that she was dying gradually became more mobile, more energetic. She started receiving visitors more regularly. She went for carriage rides. She wasn't the vigorous young woman who'd worked 20-hour days in Scutari, but she wasn't quite the helpless invalid she'd portrayed herself as either. This suggests that at least some of her invalidism had been strategic. By claiming to be too ill for social obligations, visitors, and public appearances, Florence controlled her time completely. She couldn't be dragged to social events or public celebrations. She couldn't be pressured to meet people she didn't want to meet. She could focus entirely on her work without the constant interruptions that active social participation would require. It was a brilliant strategy, actually. Victorian society couldn't argue with a woman's ill health. If she claimed to be too weak for something, no one could force her to do it without being monstrously inconsiderate. Her illness was armor against all the social obligations that would have prevented her from working. But she did suffer genuine health problems. She had chronic pain, probably from her Crimean fever. She had periods of real weakness and collapse. She likely suffered from what we'd now recognize as PTSD, nightmares about the dying soldiers, intrusive memories, emotional pain that manifested as physical symptoms. She also struggled with depression. She wrote about feeling that her life's work was inadequate, that she should have accomplished more, that the men who died in Scutari haunted her with their preventable deaths. She was never satisfied with her achievements, always pushing for more reform, more improvement, more change. Her relationship with her family remained complicated. Parthy eventually married and had a happier life, but the sisters never fully reconciled. Florence's mother died in 1880. Florence mourned, but also felt freed from family obligations that had constrained her for so long. She maintained correspondence with many of her old Crimean nurses and the early graduates of her nursing school. She followed their careers with interest, celebrating their successes and offering advice when they faced challenges. These women were her true family, the nurses carrying on her work. In her final years, Florence's mind began to fade. She developed what was probably dementia, gradually losing her fierce intellectual clarity. By 1906, she could no longer read or write. The woman who'd produced thousands of pages of reports and correspondence over decades could no longer hold a pen. She was cared for in her home by trained nurses, Nightingale nurses, following the methods she'd established. There's something poetic about that. She'd spent her life improving nursing care, and in her final vulnerable years, she received the kind of professional, compassionate nursing she'd fought to create. She died peacefully on August 13, 1910, at age 90. Her family turned down a state funeral at Westminster Abbey, honouring her wishes for a simple burial. She was laid to rest in the churchyard of St. Margaret's in East Wellow, Hampshire, near her family's estate. Her gravestone is remarkably simple for someone so famous. F.N. born 1820, died 1910. Just her initials. Nothing about being a national hero or the founder of modern nursing. It's fitting somehow. Florence never wanted to be a celebrity. She wanted to be useful. So, what do we do with Florence Nightingale's story? What does a Victorian woman who revolutionized nursing 160 years ago have to tell us tonight as we lie awake thinking our own complicated thoughts? First, your calling might not make sense to anyone else, and that's okay. Florence's family couldn't understand why she'd want to nurse instead of marry well and live comfortably. Society thought she was crazy, but she knew what she was meant to do, and she pursued it regardless of disapproval. If you feel called to something that others don't understand, if your ambitions don't fit conventional expectations, Florence's life says, do it anyway. Your calling is between you and whatever you believe gives life meaning, not between you and other people's opinions. Second, strategic stubbornness changes the world. Florence didn't politely ask for reform and accept no for an answer. She gathered evidence, built alliances, used data to prove her points, and absolutely refused to give up. She wore people down through sheer persistent pressure until they agreed to her reforms, just to get her to stop writing them 20-page letters. Sometimes changing systems requires being annoying, demanding, difficult. Florence was all of those things. She alienated people, she made enemies, but she saved lives. If you have to choose between being liked and being effective, choose effectiveness. Third, you don't need perfect health or perfect circumstances to do meaningful work. Florence spent decades claiming she was too ill to leave her bedroom, yet she accomplished more than most people do with perfect health. She proved that limitations don't prevent achievement, they just change how you work. If you're dealing with chronic illness, pain, mental health struggles, or any other challenge that makes conventional success difficult, Florence's story says you can still make an enormous impact. You just have to be creative about method. Fourth, environmental factors matter more than we think. Florence's great insight was that clean air, clean water, proper sanitation, and good design prevent disease more effectively than medical treatment. This seems obvious now, but it was revolutionary then. We still underestimate environmental factors. We focus on individual treatment while ignoring the systems and environments that make people sick in the first place. Florence would tell us to look upstream, to prevent problems rather than just treating symptoms. Fifth, building systems is more effective than being a hero. Florence could have spent her whole life nursing individual patients and saved hundreds of lives. Instead, she built a training school that produced nurses who produced more nurses, spreading her methods exponentially. She reformed hospital design across nations. She changed military medical policy. Individual heroism is satisfying, but systemic change saves more lives. If you want to make a lasting difference, build systems that perpetuate positive change even after you're gone. Sixth, you can be difficult and brilliant simultaneously. Florence wasn't a perfect angel. She was demanding, intense, sometimes cruel to the people around her. She drove Sidney Herbert so hard that she blamed herself for his early death. She alienated family members and burned through friendships, but she also saved countless lives and transformed healthcare. Complex people can do extraordinary things. You don't have to be perfectly nice to make a meaningful contribution. Sometimes changing the world requires sharp edges. Seventh, the work matters more than the recognition. Florence could have basked in her fame after returning from the Crimea. Instead, she hid from public attention and focused on unglamorous policy work, writing reports, analyzing data, advising on sanitation systems. The boring administrative work saved more lives than her dramatic nursing in Scutari. If you're doing important work that nobody celebrates or understands, keep going. The work is what matters, not the applause. Florence Nightingale's story resonates particularly strongly for women over 50 who feel like their opportunities, like their ambitious years are behind them. Because here's what Florence's life actually shows. She didn't begin her real work until she was 33 years old. Everything before that was preparation, frustrating, painful preparation that felt like wasted time, but actually equipped her with exactly the skills and knowledge she'd need. She did her most influential work after she became an invalid. The nursing school, the hospital design reforms, the policy changes. Most of that happened after her health collapsed. When conventional wisdom would say her productive years were over, she remained influential into her 80s. Victorian women were considered old and irrelevant at 50. Florence was consulting with governments and training nurses well into her 8th decade. Your most important contribution might still be ahead of you. The years you think are past your prime might actually be when you finally have the experience, wisdom, and freedom to do your real work. Florence also teaches us about the cost of calling. She gave up marriage, children, conventional happiness, her health, and decades of peace to pursue her mission. Was it worth it? She seemed to think so, even with all the pain and sacrifice. But here's the thing, you don't have to make Florence's choices. Her story isn't prescriptive. It's not saying everyone should sacrifice everything for their calling. It's saying that if you feel called to something that requires sacrifice, it's possible to do it and create meaningful change. But it's also okay to choose differently. What Florence's story does insist on is this: women's work matters. The world tried to tell Florence that her intelligence and ambition were irrelevant because she was female. Victorian society wanted to confine her to drawing rooms and social quarters. The military establishment didn't want her in their hospital. She forced the world to recognize that she had something valuable to contribute. She made space for herself through sheer stubborn refusal to be dismissed. And in doing so, she made space for all the women who came after her, the nurses, the healthcare administrators, the women in medicine and public health. Every time a woman insists that her work matters, that her intelligence deserves respect, that her contributions should be recognized, she's continuing what Florence started. There's a famous photograph of Florence Nightingale taken in 1858, shortly after she returned from the Crimea. She's not looking at the camera. Her face is turned slightly away, showing her profile. She looks exhausted, haunted, determined. It's the face of someone who's seen too much death, carries too much responsibility, refuses to quit despite everything. That photograph captures something essential about Florence. She wasn't a gentle angel of mercy. She was a warrior fighting death itself, using soap and statistics as her weapons. She was brilliant and difficult, compassionate and demanding, devoted and relentless. She spent 30 years in bed, claiming invalidism, while somehow producing enough work for 3 healthy people's lifetimes. She maintained that she was dying from about age 37 until she actually died at 90. She manipulated her illness to control her life and protect her time for work. She was complicated, contradictory, fascinating, a real person, not a sanitized saint, and she changed everything. Before Florence, nursing wasn't a profession. Hospitals were death traps. Military medicine was catastrophically neglected. Healthcare reform wasn't based on data analysis. After Florence, nursing was a skilled profession that attracted educated women worldwide. Hospitals were designed with patient health in mind. Military medical care was regulated and reformed. Healthcare policy was driven by statistical evidence. One stubborn woman with a divine calling, a lamp, and a lot of very detailed reports about sewage systems changed the world. Her legacy continues. When nurses graduate from training programs around the world, they often recite the Nightingale Pledge, a modified version of the Hippocratic Oath named in Florence's honor. When hospitals are designed with attention to ventilation, natural light, and cleanliness, they're following Nightingale principles. When healthcare policies are shaped by statistical analysis, they're using methods Florence pioneered. The Crimean War Memorial still stands near Piccadilly Circus, commemorating battles at Alma, Inkerman, and Sevastopol. But what most people remember from the Crimean War isn't the battles. It's the woman with the lamp walking through hospital corridors, bringing light into darkness. Florence Nightingale proved that one person's stubborn refusal to accept preventable suffering can save millions of lives. She proved that women's intelligence and capability deserve respect. She proved that calling is real, that some people are genuinely meant to do specific work, and that pursuing that calling, no matter the cost, can transform the world. So if you're still awake, listening in the quiet hours, here's what Florence's story offers. Your age doesn't determine your impact. Your health doesn't limit your possibilities. Your gender doesn't define your capabilities. Your family's expectations don't control your destiny. What matters is whether you hear your calling, whatever form it takes, whatever it asks of you, and whether you're brave enough to pursue it, despite everything that says you shouldn't. Florence heard God call her at 17 and spent 13 years fighting to answer that call. She worked herself to illness in Scutari and spent 50 years as an invalid who somehow kept changing the world. She died at 90, having outlived almost everyone she knew, having created a profession that would save countless lives for generations after her death. Her gravestone might say only F.N. born 1820, died 1910, but her real monument is every nurse who graduates from training, every hospital designed with patient health as the priority, every policy shaped by evidence rather than assumption, every life saved through proper sanitation and professional care. The lamp she carried through those dark corridors in Scutari still burns. It burns in every hospital ward, every nursing school, every healthcare system that prioritizes patient welfare over convenience or profit. Florence brought light into darkness, literally with her lamp, metaphorically through her work. And that light hasn't gone out in the 160 years since she returned from the Crimea. If you're struggling with your own calling, your own sense that you're meant to do something important, but everything seems to work against you, remember Florence. Remember that the woman who changed healthcare worldwide spent years trapped in her family's drawing room, then decades confined to her bedroom, yet somehow transformed the world anyway. Remember that stubbornness can be sacred when it's in service of saving lives. Remember that your intelligence matters, your work matters, your refusal to accept suffering as inevitable matters. And if you enjoyed this journey through Florence's extraordinary, difficult, triumphant life, please subscribe for more stories of women who refused to be quiet, who changed the world despite everything, who proved that calling is real and stubbornness saves lives. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight. I love knowing that these stories of remarkable women are keeping company with people all over the world, connecting us across time and space with the truth that one person's light can illuminate the darkness for generations. Sweet dream whenever they find you. And may you have the courage to carry your own lamp into whatever darkness needs light. The lady with the lamp has been watching over us for 160 years now. Her work continues in every hospital, every nursing school, every reformed healthcare system. And somewhere, I like to think, Florence Nightingale's fierce spirit is still demanding that we do better, care more, refuse to accept preventable suffering, and fight for a world where everyone receives the compassionate, professional care she spent her life establishing. Sleep well, knowing that her legacy protects you still, that when you enter a hospital, you benefit from reforms she fought for, that when nurses care for you, they follow principles she established, that the light she brought into the world still burns bright. Good night, and thank you for spending this time with Florence Nightingale. Difficult, brilliant, devoted, impossible, extraordinary Florence, who heard God's call and changed the world because she simply refused to do anything else.